First of all, I think landscape and art, or the relation between landscape and art, is a real question. And probably I would say that if we start to deal with landscape generally, or inquire into landscape, we see that there are more open questions and problems than solutions, and maybe that's what's so fascinating in landscape, that it's an open field, that each time you're trying to define it, you have to redefine it. So even if we have a lot of landscape theory and landscape history and many people working in many places parallelly on landscape, I think even very, very fundamental problems like what is landscape architecture, what do we do with landscape, what's the relation between landscape and territory, and so on, are still urgent questions. So I tell this, I like to stress it because I teach mostly in landscape architecture departments or in architecture departments, and I'm quite surprised that even my colleagues, for example, who are teaching in landscape architecture departments, don't really know what they do. I mean, maybe you have the same impression in art departments that people teach art or art history or theory and they don't really know what they do. But in landscape architecture, I'm sometimes amazed because, for example, many of our colleagues never heard of the name of Carl Theodor Sørensen, who is a very important landscape architect of the 20th century. And so they teach how to do landscape architecture without knowing it, without knowing their own tradition. So it would be like someone would start to teach painting and would say, I never heard about Monet. And then some people would tell him, well, listen, there was a guy, Monet, he had some talent and he did some good stuff. So in landscape architecture and in landscape theory generally, there is a lot of lack of theory and of I think there is a lot to do, and maybe this is fascinating, maybe this makes it an interesting field, and so one could even ask, where is the place of landscape today? Where does it take place? Where is both as a discourse and what are the really interesting places, culturally speaking, where we deal with landscape, and in what kind of, how do we deal with it? And generally, still as an introduction, if we think about the link between landscape and art, one of the most important citations which come in mind is Georg Simmel's, because Georg Simmel wrote in 1919 a seminal essay, a short essay called Philosophie der Landschaft, Philosophy of Landscape. And in Philosophy of Landscape, one of the many interesting things he says is, landscape is like a work of art in nuce, which means it's something which is a work of art, but because of its landscape, because it's ephemeral, because it takes place in the mind of someone, it never materializes. So, and this is very interesting, and I think it's interesting because today I see a link between this observation of Simmel's and some contemporary things we're confronted with if we look to contemporary aesthetics. Generally speaking, we could say that aesthetics until the mid 50s was an aesthetics of works of art, of objects, and still in the beautiful presentation before, we saw that they're objects, even if they may be negative objects, or even if these objects may existing objects. And then today there is a lot out there having to do something with the aesthetics of atmosphere. I think atmosphere is a very central concept. And Simmel wrote another essay too on Philosophie der Stimmung, and he speaks a lot about atmosphere, Stimmung. Well, Stimmung and atmosphere are not really identical, but still it's one of the possibilities to translate Stimmung would be atmosphere. And maybe landscape is something which we find in the Tate Modern and in this hall where the people who stand here are as important that the whole infrastructure having been put together, and maybe these are contemporary landscapes. So where do we go? Do we know where we go? Especially, I think, in the planning disciplines, which have to do something with landscape. I deal mainly with landscape architecture, but generally with planning disciplines. And do we know where we go, and or are we somehow very blindly going into a direction which we cannot identify so easily? And then I take this example because it's very near here, and most of you naturally know it. And but I like to show it generally because it deals with our relation to nature. And this mountain became the national Swiss mountain and a symbol, and the Matterhorn, Cervino, Cervin. Well, first of all, we forget that half of it is Italian, as we forget very often that half of Mont Blanc is Italian, so we nationalize places, and so this becomes a national site, but it really became a national site only very recently. And this is an interesting mountain because it has been hated for a very long time. You know that generally mountains have been regarded as the terrain of the devil, and that for until the 17th century, the general opinion was that mountains, the whole alpine range, which so many people like and visit today, where they will places of negativity of the devil. Hence, all these names like Via Mala, Pilatus, Drac, and so on. So you have this was a territory of the devil, and the Matterhorn was particularly seen as a negative as a negative form because it was naked. Being a naked mountain, it was interpreted as particularly ugly, even no vegetation. And all this changed very recently in the 1860s and the 1870s, and partly by Ruskin and by influenced by Ruskin's drawings and Ruskin's writings and Ruskin's photographs, and by the discovery of this mountain. But what is real nature? And how can we still grasp the beauty of Matterhorn, of this wonderful mountain, which is not very far away here in Zermatt, if we're faced with all kind of fake Matterhorns? This is, what is this? I mean, if you go around the Disneylands in the world, and Walt Disney immediately understood the potential of such an iconic object. So the Matterhorn became a form, and you could reproduce it. And then this is fantastic. I mean, this is one of the most extraordinary inventions of advertising, because everyone ate Swiss landscape. So you cannot avoid to eat Swiss landscape. You can go to the Fuji Islands, you can go in every spot in the earth. Every airport contains Swiss landscape, and everyone eats Swiss landscape. And one of the problems is, well, if a landscape becomes a commodity, if it becomes a product, if it's sold, well, can we still grasp it? What is our relation to it? So don't we lose something? I don't like the word authenticity because it's not about this, but still, there are so many filters between us and the landscape out there, and it becomes really very, very difficult to grasp these things. The second remark I want to make is that I like to remind this. I mean, most of you know it, but maybe it's not so well known. So I really don't know, because I deal with landscape and with landscape theory. I like to repeat it maybe. The word landscape came up in Europe in the 15th, 16th century. And for 3 centuries, landscape meant, the sense of landscape was exclusively history of art. It was a genre in the history of art. And we all know this by Kenneth Clark and by many other people who wrote about it. But I think it's important to stress that landscape is first of all linked to art. So landscape comes from art. Art invents landscape. And we could say even landscape experience is something very late. So first came art, and then comes landscape. First comes art and an artistic view. So first, very slowly, we have representations of pieces of nature, which we call landscape. There is a sort of genre. First, for example, in Italy, it's called paese, around 1500, and then it becomes paesaggio. And then we have these paintings by Patinier and by others. And slowly, we have the consolidation of a new genre, which is different of the portrait, etc. But landscape comes completely and altogether, completely from the realm of art. So art invents landscape. And one could add other many things. For example, a landscape is an urban invention. If you think about the Bongoverno in Siena, then we see that landscape is invented in the most important political place and site in Siena. It's really the town hall of Siena, and it's particularly an important room where the political discussions are made. And there we have the first modern landscape. So landscape comes from art, landscapes from the urban environment, and so it's very easy, would be quite easy to show and to follow this timeline, and we could start with the Bongoverno, or we could start with Patinier or with Van Eyck, whatever. I mean, you know these examples. This is the Bongoverno, where one of the possible stories we can tell about landscape takes its beginning around 1350. And this changes completely the representation of nature. And even if we know that in Rome, there were landscapes, but the Romans had no word for landscape. So there is another interesting and triggering thing about landscape when we deal with landscape. Can we speak about landscape before modernity? Because both the Greeks and the Romans had no term in order to speak about landscape. Prospectus in Latin is not landscape, and topos is not landscape, so they have no word to design it. But did they see landscape? Did they recognize landscape without having a word for it? There are a lot of possible discussion. Think about the philosophy of language. So do we see the world throughout the words we use in order to see it? Or can we think that something existed without words? So you see that it becomes quite complicated. But if we look to these Roman examples, to these beautiful paintings on the walls, where the wall becomes a sort of window. So this is long before Alberti's Finestra Aperta. This is really in the 1st century BC. So there we see that there is something happening. And then slowly around 1400, we see how landscape becomes more and more important. This is Patinier, very often shown as one of the first landscape painters. Dürer himself, he called him der gute Landschaftsmaler, the good landscape painter. So he was considered by people around 1500 that one of the first, where we are naturally in an imaginary landscape. Art historians speak about Weltlandschaft, world landscape. But we see that religious themes, for example, Saint Jerome, etc., don't interest so much Patinier, and it's more about this total or about this panoramic landscape, which you know very well. We could speak a lot about landscape generally, and for example, about the way in which Van Eyck already not only represents the fascination of landscape, and I think this is an important painting because it has to do something with the problem between art, representation, so landscape as a representation in art, and landscape experience. Generally speaking, landscape experience we won't really find it before the 17th and 18th century. It's very, very rare that, for example, travelers, many people traveled so throughout the centuries, and we have a lot of descriptions. But for example, Montaigne, and in his essays, you know Montaigne by his essays, but Montaigne made a very important journey to Italy. And if we look to his journey, we see that he doesn't see the world as a landscape. So Montaigne was incredibly open-minded and so seminal for many, many things in philosophy, but still he wouldn't see the world as a landscape. We could say it's a sort of pre-landscape. It's something before landscape. He's very interested, he's very curious, but he sees houses, he sees buildings, he sees trees, he sees the objects in the landscape rather than thinking landscape. He would never say, this is a beautiful landscape. Never will you find c'est un beau paysage, never. But he will say, c'est un beau château, it's always a beautiful castle, it's well done, etc. So we could say that his point of view is more economical than really aesthetic. And then, but surprisingly, around 1440, Van Eyck seems to tell us something about the future landscape view as experience as well, because we have these two small figures there sitting. But this would take us very long again on another trip. And but I think it's a very interesting painting, which is a dialogue already with many things which we'll find later in landscape tradition. So a timeline, history of art. So you all know these important paintings. So many of the very important paintings we deal with, sometimes we'll call them landscape. Is it right to call them landscape? Is it not? Well, this is an open question, because sometimes we'll say, well, this is a consolidated, this is something which everyone will agree to call a landscape, but it's a sublime landscape of the 17th century. But in some other examples, it's more difficult. And then again, still with the starting point, art and landscape. Well, this is probably the most influential painter for landscape experience which we ever existing in whoever existed in history. It's Claude Lorrain. And Claude Lorrain is a very interesting example, because Claude Lorrain influenced directly so many things. For example, the so-called Picturesque garden in England, and many other things. But Claude Lorrain, for centuries, when people thought about landscape, they would immediately say Lorrain. Sometimes Poussin, Lauterbourg, and other figures, but they would say Lorrain was really the main example. And Lorrain is an interesting example because, what kind of landscapes are these? Sometimes we read pastorals, ideal landscape, and so on. But here again, did Lorrain have a landscape experience, and what kind of experience, and how did he study nature? Because all these are compositions. I mean, Lorrain is a contemporary of Racine and Corneille, and all this has a lot to do with rhetorics, and maybe a lot less with the observation of nature in the 17th century. So these are compositions, but they become very influential. So this is again the timeline, and we go on, and then we come to different moments when already around in the 18th century, there is a sense of the crisis of the genre landscape. So I spoke first of all now about the genre landscape, a certain type of paintings which exist from Lorenzetti to, let's say, 18th and 19th century. But already in the 18th century, things become complicated. There is a beautiful book by Bechmann called Die Entfernung von der Natur. So how step-by-step painters who were fascinated by nature, at the same time they go one step behind. So there is a sort of process of negation, and things become complicated. And one of the examples is, for example, Thomas Jones, someone who is not very well known. He made his grand tour. He stayed sometime in Italy, and we see that he is one of the first who dares to paint motifs where there is no human presence at all. So these are some very strange things. And then, naturally, the crisis of landscapes. The crisis of landscape, there have been even seminars and books on this crisis of landscape, la mort du paysage, the death of landscape. But Gottfried Böhm wrote some very interesting articles where he says, for example, in the work of Monet, we see how we lose the sense of landscape. Because a landscape exists as long as there is a point of view. It's in front of us. Landscape is a very European category. And landscape being in front of us, we need the possibility to project ourselves into landscape. And we have to, with Monet's late work, we don't know anymore, so we don't recognize anymore the nature represented. So we could say nature is absolutely the theme of Monet, but it's no more mimetic nature, but it's a sort of transposition. It has more to do with energy and with colors, and it's a way to think about nature. So nature is absolutely the one thing which interests painters like Monet or Cézanne and Mondrian, etc., even in their abstract phases. But they don't do it anymore in a mimetic way, but they do it in a different way. So it's more about metaphoric transposition and so on. So you can take all these examples you know very well, where we are no more in a sort of mimetic representation, but beyond. And then again, dealing with the relation between landscape and art, it's interesting to highlight too that only in the 19th century are we confronted with plein air painting. So plein air painting didn't exist until the 19th century. It's extremely recent. I mean, Constable, Cézanne, and all these guys, they continue to say in their letters, in their publication, that they say, no one ever saw a landscape before me. Constable says, how have all these painters were blind? Because they all were academic painters, so they all worked with rhetoric, they all arranged their compositions, it was about composition, but never any real experience. And so Constable and Cézanne will say, well, I really need to go out there, and you know how Cézanne turns for 20 years and more around Mont Sainte-Victoire, and it becomes a sort of impossible task, because he is out there and he moves around the mountain, but it's always a different mountain, and so he's never able to fix it. So here again we see how the relation between landscape and nature becomes complicated. Here we could show this crisis of representation with Mondrian. So you still recognize a tree, we still recognize a tree, we recognize the dunes, but it becomes something abstract. And here it's no more about, it's still about nature. The one central question is about nature, but it's no more a landscape. It's something. It's a way to think about nature. For example, taking the main colors and to think about the chromatic composition of world and what is nature, what kind of forces. So it's more about physics. It's a different point of view. So all this happens, and we see different timeline. Now, in the, say, 18th century, there is a different development, quite interesting as well, because it's the first century where people really start to have landscape experience. And we have many documents. So landscape until the 18th century was something artistic. Its place was art. And from the 18th century on, people start to look for landscape, for beautiful landscape. They're fascinated by landscape. So they make landscape tours. Thomas Cook already organizes this. He has a real British sense of business, and so you will go and organize the tours. You want to see picturesque landscape? Okay, I'll organize it. And sublime landscapes and so on. So everything is organized, and in the 18th century you can do these trips in all security. So now it's no more like in John Dennis's, an important figure in the 17th century, or in earlier centuries where people made a grand tour and they tried to go and to experience nature. Now you can have the experience of nature without any danger. So you can sit there in a very bourgeois manner. It's like in a museum, it's the same thing. So you can sit there and you have a direct access to nature. And by the way, very European. I remind the beautiful book by William Mitchell, too, Landscape and Power, where he says landscape is a very imperial and maybe imperialistic something, because it has to do with control, scopic control. And here you see very well, these guys, they own the landscape because they can sit there, and they own the view, and because they can afford it. And I like this example too, because you all know Heidi. And Heidi is funny too, because you know Heidi's story, which was a bestseller in the 19th century and became a world bestseller, translated I don't know in how many languages. And Heidi was published, and Heidi is a promise of the possibility to come back to pure nature. So pristine nature, primeval nature, and the pure Heidi, she lost her parents, she goes into a Swiss valley, she found the most wonderful grandfather, animals, everything is wonderful, pure, beautiful, sublime, and so on. But Heidi is really fake. I mean, Heidi doesn't work. And Heidi doesn't work because Heidi became an absolute bestseller exactly at the same moment when the Alps were completely transformed. So if you think about, not only about Maupassant, La Grande Ixence, etc., but you have to think, I like to say to my students, especially landscape architects, and sometimes people in ecology, because we have people who study ecology too, there is nothing more artificial than nature. And especially alpine nature. I mean, if we look to alpine nature, it's a big machine. Thousands of dams. We saw today these beautiful dams, unfinished. But the dams normally in Europe are finished, but if you look around, it's unfinished. There is a sense of disorder. There are many things which you don't get the sense why they're there. And so Heidi became a bestseller. And Heidi is a promise of wonderful landscapes, of perfect landscapes. But it's a promise which was done exactly at the moment when we completely and forever destroyed nature. Because it's a moment when hydroelectricity took over. And if you look now, there is no waterfall. I mean, the famous writer from Valais, Maurice Chapin, he quite often wrote about, he said, when I was young, I still heard I still had the chance to hear all these wonderful rivers and the waterfalls. This was fantastic. And he said, it's all over. Because today, all this is part of a gigantic plumbing system and which belongs to hydroelectrical companies. So Heidi is a sort of false promise at the moment when we see that this doesn't work. But we still want to believe that it works. And so we have our friends from Bollywood who come here. And I never understood it why they come to Switzerland. Because there are some mountains in India too. I mean, and not of the least. But they come to Switzerland, they love here, and they make always, it's always the same film. They dance, etc. So they come here, but for them it's a perfect nature. It's a sort of perfect dream nature, and they don't see that everything is completely artificial. Even the chalet. What is a chalet? Well, the chalet it's a sort of pre-industrial construction. It has a very, very strict sense, so it's not there per chance. It's not natural. But we take the wood as a sort of metonymy of the forest and of nature, and we think this is perfect nature, but it's not like this. So you see, if we deal with nature and landscapes, and landscape has always to do something with nature, many questions which come to mind. And I like to stress something different too. I had the chance to work these last 2 years with my students in Harvard on these kind of problems, and I will try to say it really very quickly. So if we deal with landscape, there are two main narratives. The one narrative is the one I mentioned before. Landscape comes from history of art, from a certain European tradition of history of art. Then there are some other problems. Can we speak about landscape in China, etc.? But I will leave this away because it will take us too far. Well, the first narrative is landscape comes from art. Art invents landscape. And then there is a second narrative, which is quite important too, and it's landscape is something which has to do with philosophy. And it's interesting because I would even say that this is quite true, and it's interesting. There is a sense why landscape is so central in aesthetics. And because landscape has something to do with subjectivity, with the subject, because landscape is a relation between us and a subject and the world. So something has to happen between us, a subject, someone who sees the world, and the world out there, a piece of nature. And when the two come together, I would say rather by surprise, landscape exists. So landscape is a mediation. It's a sort of, it's miraculous, but it's not mystical. It's miraculous because it's incredible. I cannot predict it. I cannot predict this. I can have a walk here, but at a certain moment, landscape exists in my mind, and then it disappears, and then I see another landscape. But I can prepare it. I can wish to see landscapes, but I cannot really, when the moment when landscapes comes into reality is something almost miraculous. So it comes by surprise. And this is interesting, and there you see the parallels with the aesthetic experience, but it's exactly the same thing when you go to a museum. Everyone would like to have aesthetics experiences and be happy in front of Cézanne and of all the other works and of all the other works of art. But you walk and I don't know, it's not a good day, it's raining, you're hungry. There are thousands of reasons not to see works of art. And even museums are machines which make impossible to see works of art. But this is another thing, because I think, for example, the name tags are a way in order to invite us not to see things, because rather than looking and to expose yourself to a work of art, which is never innocent, you look to a name tag and you go on to the next one. And I think it would be more important maybe, therefore I think places like Insel Hombroich in Germany are very interesting because there are no tags. And this is wonderful. You cannot go there and to see, oh, it's again a Graubner and it's again a Fautrier or Medardo Rosso. You're in front of a work of art and it says, shit, you have to concentrate here. You have to respect me. You cannot go on like in a catalog. This is not a catalog. Art is not a catalog. Art is not about this. Art is about being exposed to a work of art. And Rilke said, well, I understand very well that if you're confronted to a work of art, it's not pleasant. It's like being in love. Being in love, it's not very pleasant. I mean, you have always to think about her or him, and it's like a démangeaison. I mean, you become very nervous because you say, I was a free person, and now I have always to think about it. And, well, experience a work of art means this. I mean, you're really touched by something. It really comes by surprise. And so this is the second explanation. So it takes us into philosophy and into the core of philosophy, into aesthetics, and then what is the self, and many, many abstract things. So these are two well-known narratives, and you have many people who wrote about it, very intelligent books, and many literature you find out there in German, in Italian, in French, Rosario Assunto in Italy, or Augustin Berger, Alain Roger in France, and I don't know, many, many other people who wrote on it. But I would like to add a third perspective, and I tried to work these last 2 years on something which I call the technological invention of landscape. And landscape has a lot to do with framing. And I would say that there is a technological history of landscape, and I would argue that landscape exists only thanks to some technologies. And technology means not only abstract things, but really devices. And naturally, in the 20th century, if we go to La Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier, we see how, because he intended this to be a promenade architecturale, well, it's a promenade paysagère as well, because it's a promenade where you create landscapes, and all these windows create landscapes. But I think we have to go back further into maybe in the 15th century and remind the famous experience of Brunelleschi and 1425 February in Florence, and the invention or the reinvention of one-point perspective or central perspective. And so I think there is a lot to say about the birth of landscape as a genre in the 15th century, and what Alberti calls, or Leonardo calls, velo or reticolato, this grid, and at the same time, the invention of the modern window, and so many things. So I would say there are technologies, there are objects so landscape doesn't come only from philosophy. Very beautiful to be very Heideggerian or Husserlian about it, but I think there is a material history of landscape conscience. And this material history is linked to objects and devices. And so naturally I was interested in the history, in many aspects of this, and the scopic devices, for example, the bench, which is very clearly something which is used as a possibility to frame things. But many other things come to mind. For me, this is technology too. Virilio wrote some beautiful pages about this, where he says, with the introduction of the horse, everything changes in European history. Because to see the world from the horse means to organize sight in a very different way as when you walk. And people, well, if you have the mounted police and all these policemen who sit on a horse, well, this is you see the power of scopic power. I mean, the cop on a horse says, "Be careful, because I can shoot you any moment." So you'd rather be careful, and this means there is a sense of control. And this sense of control, we find it in many, many other devices, topographic devices. And so landscape, in the way I try to rethink it, I think it's interesting to rethink our concepts, because this is what I think we should do when we are in the human sciences. We have always to redefine and rethink things. And then you get an awareness for why other scopic devices and inventions are so important. Telescope, or for example, the Claude glass. The Claude glass has been, at least for 200 years, painters use the Claude glass. So the explanation, landscape comes from art. Well, between landscape and art, we have this other artificial object, which is a mirror, and you have different forms. And this is a young Gainsborough using one of these devices in order to frame landscape. So you think between the result and the experience, you have these kind of devices. And then naturally, everything becomes more complicated with the modern inventions like photography. By the way, the first photography, is it a landscape? Well, anyhow, it's a sort of landscape of architecture. This is Niepce, and it's a view from his studio. And then the train. You spoke before about the view from the train. This would be a very interesting theme, how we learned to cope with the speed of images. We learned to cope with the speed of images, and Schivelbusch wrote a very beautiful book on the story of Die Geschichte der Eisenbahnfahrt, where he speaks about the way in which really the train system changed everything. Not only the perception of the world, because we had to deal with speed, and this was something very, very brutal, because people suffered by vertigo, and doctors wrote papers and said, especially women, never take the train because you will get hysteric, and it's very, very dangerous for humanity. So it took 10 or 20 years in order to accept this. And Apollinaire wrote a very beautiful poem where he says, what happens with the sight when you have all these trees which move too quickly? So there was a cultural work, a sort of Arbeit, really work on the new site, and it took some time in order to learn how to do it. But now we see, nowadays, naturally, landscape is a mode on computers, on telephones, so it became already almost automatic. But this is very recent, and certainly our generation and the next generation will define landscape in a way which is really completely influenced by this kind of devices. And if you think about the 1890s and around 2000, when we had these new VHS portable things, 80% of tourists would, rather than look to landscapes, film the landscape, and then when they would come home, they would punish the family, and they had to look again the films which they were taking. And this is the modern version of what happened in the 60s and 70s, when they made slides, and then you have the slide projection. And you know, someone who understood very well how perverse this is and how artificial our landscapes are is Jacques Tati in Playtime. We remember this wonderful theme when we see, we are outside this window and we see inside, and you have the television and the slides and etc. So it's all theater. So can we what about our relation to nature and many other devices, for example architecture, panoramas, panoramic points of view, which which invite us to have a natural way to see landscape, but it's completely constructed. Do I still have some time or not? A little time?
Yeah, sure, like
10 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So another possible chapter is, I thought it would be interested to question the relation from the 18th century on between landscape experience to art and art to landscape experience. Because it's the first historic moment when we have both. So we have art, but in a certain crisis already, representation, and at the same time we have landscape experience. And though this becomes a dialectical process. And I just want to give you 3 or 4 very, very quick examples. The first one is interesting because it's the inventor of landscape architecture. So landscape architecture is a very recent discipline, and arguably it all starts with Humphrey Repton. Now Humphrey Repton is an artist, and he's an artist, and he, in 1789, he prints this business card. So very British sense of, very pragmatic of business immediately. So he makes this business card and he says, I'm no more a gardener, I'm a landscape gardener. And what he meant, I'm a landscape architect. And so he says, I can design something. I can design landscape. And he said, you're used to pay gardeners and all kind of workers, the guys you see downstairs. But he says, I am the one who sells the project, the design, and pay a lot for this because I sell ideas. And so you see how the history of landscape architecture, and then it goes on with Olmsted and with many others, and it's still a history to be written because we don't know a lot about it. Well, it comes from art, and it's a transposition of art, and something quite important starts here. Here again, you see almost a sort of birth certificate. Humphrey Repton himself, he's quite proud, and you know that he made these famous red books, and he would go from one client to another and paint, and then give him the project in the form of a book. And the book is already a sort of interesting object. It's something. Sort of ready-made. I know it's a complicated object, semiotically. We could analyze it. But anyhow, you see he's drawing. He's an artist. But he's drawing something, and out of his mind and of his hand and of a pencil comes the project. So he invents something. So landscape architecture comes from art and comes from this artistic skills, and it becomes something different. Then we saw some glaciers here, and another very, very interesting theme which we should deal with is the Sublime. The whole aesthetics of Sublime, starting with John Dennis, going on with Addison and Shaftesbury and so on, and I would state this like this. In the 18th century, people learn to see landscapes. So today for us, it's so natural to see, to love, to know landscapes. But in the 18th century, there was a real pedagogical movement to teach how to recognize landscapes. So the sense of the sublime and the sense of the picturesque didn't come from, it didn't exist at a certain moment, but it was a process. And in this process, art was very important. And this is Caspar Wolf. Caspar Wolf is a very interesting example because he was a young Swiss painter, and he started his career in Paris. And then a gallerist from Bern, Abraham Wagner, recognized that mountains and the sublime became very sexy, very trendy. So he said, Wolf, come here. And he said, Wolf, please do me a collection of paintings. And it was already very Benjaminian because he had the originals there, and the clients came and they said, I want this one. And I said, Wolf, please do me 3 copies of the Glacier. Mm-hmm. So it was a sort of multiplication. He made patterns. So you see, his way to paint sublime nature or picturesque scenes was already a quite complex process of transformation. And here you see how, and it goes even farther, and it's far more interesting because if you really carefully look to these paintings, we almost everywhere find in the 18th century small people, very small people. This is the sublime. You remember the sublime is something that nature becomes so grand and so infinite that human beings are small, but at the same time our liberty, our sense of freedom makes that we are still bigger than nature, etc. But in all these paintings, you find small figures, and these people are painting. By the way, to come back to Humphrey Repton was someone who made wonderful garden projects for his clients, but when he finished his project, he went to his client, and these were all new rich and earls, so people who took themselves very seriously. But Humphrey Repton obliged his clients to draw the project. He says, it's not enough to pay. You have to draw and to paint your own garden. If not, you won't understand it. So you see how important the understanding and understanding the world by drawing was in the 18th century. So this makes that, I would say that the image of nature, and especially of alpine nature with the sublime and the picturesque, is really a construction. And it's a construction of the 18th century. For example, Reverend Gilpin in England, he wrote several books and guidebooks, and he said, I have to teach people to recognize the picturesque. So the people didn't know the picturesque, but they learned to interpret it. No one liked cottages before 1800. People said cottages are horrible places of horrible people. But then the Romantics started to say, oh, the Lake District and so on. And we have in Wordsworth and we have many other examples where we see that if we look before 1750, almost no interest in a cottage, almost no interest in a chalet. And then everything changes, and it became very trendy to have these objects, and so people then imitated them. So therefore I show this image where we see that our way to interpret things and to see landscape is really something which is fabricated, which is a cultural construction, extremely complicated cultural construction. And if we think about our conscience and about what happens when we see a landscape, where we are a sort of millefeuille, we're a sort of very, very complicated something where there is so many layers, but normally we have an awareness only of the last layers and of the last strata, where in reality there are many, many things. So people really learn to interpret this and to get to know. So can we speak about how artificial is landscape? Or maybe our landscape is already at its beginnings artificial. And the Romantics around 1800, it's very interesting to see that around 1800 there is already a fatigue with landscape. So it took so much time in order to learn how to recognize landscape, grossly the 18th century. But around 1800, too many people seeing too many landscapes and always the same landscapes. So the Romantics, both the German Romantics, the French, and other Romantics, they say, oh, landscapes are no more very interesting. And what do? They invent the inner landscape. If you think about Baudelaire, he says, I hate nature. Nothing is more horrible than trees. Like Socrates, remember, 2,500 years ago, he says, I have nothing to learn from trees and shrubs. I am interested in human nature. And Baudelaire says, I'm only interested in the city. Everything out there is not interesting. So the romantic landscape becomes an imaginary landscape. And it becomes something artistic. So it's something fantastic. Because human beings can invent landscapes which are really landscapes of total fantasy. And the whole Romantic program, so if you think about writers like Jean-Paul Richter already around 1810, they invent landscapes. They don't have any reference anymore because the places there are already too many people who look to these places. And if we come back to the Alps, we see how the most beautiful spots are occupied by, for example, like hotels. And in a hotel on the balcony, well, you have an immediate relation to nature. But do you still have a relation to the nature? Or is this relation lost? What happens on such a balcony? And who has access to landscape? And at what time? And in what sense? So you see that, therefore, I would say that landscape becomes really extremely complicated. And I won't speak about about land art and earth art, etc., because this was very happily said and done before. So I would have liked to say something final, but I won't say it because I think another example of trying to understand what happens between art and landscape is to analyze critically, for example, the work of three artists. Derek Jarman's garden in Dungeness, Kent, Prospect Cottage. Charles Jenks says A Garden of Cosmic Speculation. Already the title is a little cosmic, and Ian Hamilton Finlay's Little Sparta. I would think this is another way to try to see how landscape and art come together. But there are many, many others. We could analyze Hamish Fulton and Richard Long and many, many other examples. But I wanted to concentrate on some historical origins. And I think, at least that's my opinion, that landscape has this extraordinary capacity to oblige us to always come back and to rethink it. Thanks for your attention.